Hey, it's Brewbird. This video is a beginner's guide to understanding different types of whiskeys. Now, whiskey can fall into one of three categories. The first is single malt whiskey, which is made with malt, water, and yeast. The second are grain whiskeys, which are made with cereals other than malted barley, such as oats, rye, or wheat. Now, grain whiskeys will usually contain a small percentage of malted barley anyways, because there's enzymes in the malt that help convert the starches in the cereals into sugars. Lastly, we have blended whiskeys, which are a blend of malt and grain whiskeys. So when you go to the store, the label might specify that it's a blended malt whiskey, which means it's a blend of malt whiskeys only. Or it could say that it's a blended malt and grain whiskey, which means it's a blend of both kinds. Generally, single malt whiskey is more expensive than blended whiskey, which is ironic because it takes a lot more skill to create a blended whiskey than a single malt. If you think about it, the master blender has to work with 2 or maybe even 50 different whiskeys in order to come up with that one blend. He's got to mix all the whiskeys to the correct proportions to come up with a blend that tastes the same each and every single time. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially if you were to run out of one of the whiskeys that make up the blend. I'm in Scotland right now, which is famous for Scotch whiskey. Notice there's no E at the end. To legally be called Scotch, it has to be produced in Scotland and matured here for at least 3 years and 1 day in oak cask. Most Scotch is made with peated malt, which gives it a characteristically deep and smoky flavor. You can get Scotch that has burnt, rubbery flavors, so it's probably best that if you're trying whiskey for the first time, you don't start with a Scotch. Scotland is divided into the whiskey regions Highland, Lowland, and Speyside, as well as the protected localities of Islay and Campbelltown. Each region will produce whiskey with a different regional flavor profile. For example, Islay is known for its heavily peated whiskies, whereas here at the Borders Distillery, we're in the lowlands. Since there's no peat in the soil here, there's no peat used in the production of our whiskey, so it has a smooth and refined character. Like Scotland, Ireland makes malt and grain whiskies. Unlike Scotch, which is usually double distilled, Irish whiskey is usually triple distilled, giving it a comparatively lighter character. It's usually more smooth in taste and easy to drink. And big names here are Jameson and Bushmills. One style of Irish whiskey worth mentioning is the single pot still whiskey. This is a whiskey made of a combination of malted and unmalted barley. There might also be a small addition of other cereals such as wheat and oats. Irish pot still whiskey was created in the 1800s when the government levied many taxes on distilleries in Ireland, one of them being the malt tax. To get around paying the full amount of this malt tax, distilleries started including unmalted barley in their grain bills. Thus, the Irish pot still whiskey was born. It tastes similar to a single malt whiskey, but the unmalted barley gives it a distinctive spiciness, a grainy and more funky cereal flavor that isn't present in a Scotch or an Irish whiskey. Most of the whiskey coming out of Canada is of the blended variety, but the country is most famous for producing rye whiskey. The addition of flavorful rye is most likely a contribution from Dutch and German settlers who first came to Canada. The rye imparts a spicy and fruity flavor to the whiskey. In fact, rye was such a common addition to whiskey that the term Canadian whiskey and rye whiskey are now interchangeable. The legal definitions for Canadian whiskey are very loose. Distilleries are able to label their product as rye whiskey even if the grain bill contains less than 10% rye in it. Whereas in the United States, a rye whiskey must contain at least 51% rye to meet the legal definition of a rye whiskey. That's why many people claim that Canadian whiskey is not a true rye whiskey. As well, in Canada, colorings and flavoring additives are permitted for use in whiskey. Many purists who think that nothing but water should be added between transferring the whiskey from the cask to the bottle think that these additives reduce the quality of the whiskey. One very unique aspect of whiskey making in the United States is that it does not have a maturation age requirement. So the minute it comes off the still, it's legally called whiskey. Whereas in Scotland and Ireland, the spirit has to be matured in oak casks for at least 3 years until it can legally be called whiskey. Bourbon is one of the most famous kinds of whiskey in the United States. Bourbon has to be made in the US, and it has to have a minimum of 51% corn in it and be stored in new oak casks. The use of corn is a nod to America's farming roots. The corn imparts a sweeter flavor to the whiskey when compared to Scotch or Irish whiskey. Another popular whiskey style from the States is Tennessee whiskey. It must be produced in the state of Tennessee and must undergo a filtration process called the Lincoln County process, where the spirit is filtered through charcoal chips before being transferred into casks to mature. Japanese whiskey. Japan is famous for taking inventions from other countries and perfecting them, and whiskey is a textbook example of this. Varied, nuanced, and complex, Japanese whiskey has no set flavor profile. Two of the biggest names in the whiskey game in Japan are Nikka and Suntory. Nikka's founder, Masataka Taketsuru, traveled to Scotland and trained at several whiskey distilleries before returning to Japan in 1920. He helped found a whiskey distillery with Suntory before going on to create Nikka whiskey. It's due to his experiences in Scotland that Japanese whiskey tends to be most stylistically similar to Scotch. There's no strict legal definition of Japanese whiskey, so distilleries can take their whiskey and blend it with Scotch or some other neutral spirit and still legally call it Japanese whiskey. To fix this issue and to help maintain the integrity of Japanese whiskey, the Japanese Whiskey Association will be coming up with a legal definition for Japanese whiskey sometime in the near future. When you're out shopping for a bottle of whiskey, you should now be a bit more informed on the differences between whiskeys from different countries. Please support the channel by giving this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more distilling and distillery videos. This is Brewbird sending good vibes your way. I'll see you next time.